We never thought that it was of European interest to have Nord Stream 2. That was absolutely clear from the very first plans. I think Jean-Claude Juncker, then President of the European Union, said that in very clear terms. It has been a discussion between the Commission and European institutions in Germany, I think, ever since the very first plans were made. But we don't see it as a pipeline of European interest.
Hallo und herzlich willkommen zu einer neuen Ausgabe von Handelsblatt-Disrupt, dem Podcast über neue Ideen, Disruption und die Zukunft Europas. Mein Name ist Sebastian Matthes und ich begrüße Sie wie immer ganz herzlich aus unserem Podcast-Studio hier in Düsseldorf. Was will eigentlich Europa? Auf jeden Fall kein Gas aus der Nord Stream 2 Pipeline und keine Drohung von Facebook-Chef Mark Zuckerberg. Dafür eine technologische Alternative bieten zu den Hightech-Supermächten China und den USA. Das zumindest sagt Margrethe Vestager, die dänische Vizepräsidentin der EU-Kommission. Mit ihr habe ich im Rahmen der Konferenz Europe 2022 gesprochen, einem gemeinsamen Event von Handelsblatt, Zeit und dem Tagesspiegel. Bei dieser Konferenz habe ich auch meinen zweiten Gesprächspartner interviewt. Er sagt ebenfalls Nein zu Nord Stream 2, dafür Ja zu Atomkraft. Über die Hintergründe und sein Werben um Verständnis für die Position Frankreichs spreche ich mit dem französischen Wirtschaftsminister Bruno Le Maire, der zudem mehr Geld für europäische Startups möglich machen will. Und damit zu meinem Gespräch mit Margrethe Vestager. Good morning and hello to Brussels. Great to have you here.
Good morning. Great to see you.
And there's the big battle about the tech supremacy between the United States and China. Europe is not only stuck somehow in the middle between these two tech superpowers, it's also lagging behind in so many fields. So how could Europe's role look like in this power play?
Well, first and foremost, I don't think that we should underestimate ourselves because Europe is a powerhouse when it comes to prosperity, trade, productivity. In some areas of digitization, Europe is very, very strong. Take our abilities when it comes to research in semiconductors or the machinery to produce semiconductors, just to give you two very specific examples. And I think if we see ourselves as the people we are, we could shape sort of a third way between a very, very market-driven society and a very state-driven society. And I think we're getting there more and more. You would see that, I think, both in the CHIPS Act that we table today, but also in how we push for digital rights and principles for each and every one as citizen to enjoy a human-centered digitization.
It's clear that Europe has strengths, but also the business in so many high-tech fields are done somewhere else. So how could a European industry policy look like to find really this third way you were just talking about?
We have an industrial policy, and the goal of that is to enable European industry to lead the green and the digital transition. And, that is... For me, that is much more strategic and much more far-reaching than to say we want to have the global market share XX in this field or XX in that field. No, it's about the role that European industry can play. And, one of the things that really sort of impressed me was in sort of the first year of the pandemic, we didn't know what way it would go. So, we were analyzing, making scenarios. And one of the first to come knocking our door was European industry saying, don't you waver now. You made the strategic choice that we should be climate neutral, that we should digitalize. This is what we're ready to do. Mm. That doesn't make it easy, but it shows that there is a community, there is an alliance between politics and industry this year to push forward for these things that are so crucial for creating societies that are worth living in for us as citizens and as human beings.
What you just said, to lead the fight against climate change and the digitization, this is always right. But what does that actually mean? So how can this become industry policy? Or does the economy has to solve that for themselves?
No, I think we need to help each other out, in particular because we're in a hurry. We have very little time to make this happen. So, for instance, decarbonizing production processes, that businesses sign up for that, and that we as taxpayers, as states, can come in and give a helping hand in order for it to happen really fast. Take the projects that we do on batteries. They are quite amazing because, taxpayers' state support comes in, takes sort of the most extreme risk, and that crowds in so much private investment. So we really develop European industry right now, as we speak. The biggest investments globally in batteries, in the breadth of it, is in Europe.
How much can the European help to build European champions? Is that something member states should try to do, the European Union should try to do, or what is your point of view on that?
Oh, but we do have European champions.
Yes, but we need some more in certain fields, right? So is that something politics should try to do?
Well, it's difficult to say, well, how can you say that we need some in certain fields? Because we have in many important sectors. And I think one should be really, really careful as a politician to think that you can see through what is the real market. We need industry to be the actors here, and we need taxpayers and politicians to give a helping hand. And that helping hand is, of course, to get to the objectives that we have actually set in common, because we live in democracies. So we set our strategic targets in common. But it's really important that we use the drivers of this social market economy that we live in. One of the most important drivers for innovation is competition. That we have learned again and again and again over the decades. So the thing about Europe that makes this place really special is that it's a social market economy, that politics and industry can do things together while maintaining these fundamental drivers.
Since last week, we know the European Union's plans to pump some 43 billion into European chip production via the new European Chips Act. The goal is to increase the production of semiconductors from 9% today to 20% by 2030. What would you consider is the most important aspect of this new Chips Act?
Well, I think for me, the most important thing is to enable also small and medium-sized businesses to be part of this new generation of industry, where everything needs a chip and where chips can make so much more value in the business model that you have already. So that we create a new infrastructure based on these super research institutions that we have already to enable, a design platform, pilot lines, so that many more businesses can come on board for real. Because already quite a number of things are happening. We have the first important project of common European interest in semiconductors already delivering results. The second one, a giant project, I think with 100 businesses and 20 member states already in the pipeline. I'm quite sure that it will improve what we do in the business community. And then, of course, the plans to establish first of its kind production facilities in Europe to complement what is done already, because as you will know, a number of businesses, they do produce chips in Europe, specialized chips for manufacturing, power chips that can maintain high voltage, or chips as they do in Spain. You have here a European champion producing chips for almost any car key on this planet.
Right. And also in this CHIPS Act, the way member states can do state subsidies will change quite a bit. So how do you look at that? Is that the right way? Because as from what I understand, you had a different position in the past.
We will not change our rules. We have the rules of the treaty, which means that we can look at things like first of a kind establishment of facilities. And the reason it's important to have control of that aid being handed out is, of course, to prevent a subsidy race, so that whatever subsidy is only what is necessary, what is proportionate, and then, of course, to make sure that there is a pan-European benefit from it. because it would be really ironic if we, by accident, sort of reproduced the global unbalance in Europe, just having a European unbalance where only a few member states with deep pockets had the benefit, and it was not a benefit for this European industrial system that we do live in.
Okay, and will chip producers in Europe be forced to deliver first to European companies in times of crisis, like what we've seen in the last 1.5 years?
Well, what we have seen, this extreme situation where there is a shortage, that should be prevented. It's not possible to help this shortage out politically on a sort of in a month or in a year or in 2 years' time. But we can do quite a lot to prevent it from happening again. And the most important thing to prevent it, that is to have international cooperation. Within the Trade and Technology Council with the US, we talk about this, how to fully understand why this shortage came about, how to prevent them in the future, to have agreement with the US, with South Korea, Singapore, Japan, but also as a last resort, if everything else has been done, well, then to say, if you are in Europe, if you've been supported in Europe, then you also have an obligation to the European ecosystem.
There has been news around tech regulation, something like the answer of Meta, the Facebook parent company, that said it might have to stop delivering Facebook and Instagram in Europe because of the new data protection laws in Europe. Is that something you are taking seriously?
Well, that's up to Facebook. It's their business disposition if where they want to deliver their business. What for us is important is, of course, that when our legislator have agreed on the rights that we have as individuals, rights concerning the data that we produce ourselves, that tells a lot about us. Those rights, of course, will have to be upheld also when data travel. And I think in every jurisdiction it is so that you're welcome to do business if you live up to what has been decided in the democracy that is the governing of that market.
Facebook is also trying to build something like the future of the internet, so-called metaverse. This is also a topic for European regulation, right?
Well, that we have started to analyze, also because the metaverse is here already. When people are gaming and they can enter a universe with their avatar and they can act in that universe, that is already here. So it's not just trying to understand something that will happen in the far future. It is something that has started already. So, of course, we start analyzing, well, what will be the role for a regulator? What is the role for our legislator? Because now with both the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, our legislators sort of really regain the territory that was usually to some degree left for businesses in the digital sphere. And I think that is really good. And that, of course, should continue also when that digital sphere develops into more and more of a metaverse.
Speaking of markets, the biggest topic in European economy are spiking energy prices, especially for gas. Some analysts say the liberalization of the energy market went too far in Europe. Are they right?
I find that difficult to judge, actually. One of the things that has benefited us a lot is the market construction that sort of allows the cheapest energy source to produce as much as possible before the next one kicks in, and then prices are matched by that. Now, when we have a high demand of energy and very high gas prices, it means that every source of energy, also sources of energy that's really cheap to produce, becomes really, really expensive. So, of course, it's important for us to understand, is there something that can be done within that market mechanism for prices to come down? Because otherwise, with the geopolitical situation, there is a risk that high gas prices for quite some time will keep the prices in general at a very high level. And this is why it's not enough just to say, well, we can support end consumers for a couple of months or for 6 months. No, we also need to understand if there's more we can do in order for prices more to reflect the cost of the differences of energy sources.
But what would that be? Longer lasting contracts, for example, something that the EU has been opposing for quite some time.
Well, that is one thing, but then you need someone who would want to sign a longer.
So does that mean this is on the table?
Well, the thing with the contract is that you need a counterpart in order to sign that contract. And that has been part of the issue that some of our suppliers would not supply more. So what we're trying to do is to diversify where we get the gas. For instance, to have more liquid gas, LNG, coming into our system. Because the point with liquid gas is that you can transport it in these gigantic, very sophisticated vessels, which means that the market becomes much bigger. Because otherwise, you're stuck with the suppliers with whom you have a pipeline.
So the US just announced, speaking of pipelines, they will stop Nord Stream 2 if Russia invades Ukraine. Does Europe need this pipeline?
Well, we never thought that it was of European interest to have Nord Stream 2. That was absolutely clear from the very first plans. I think Jean-Claude Juncker, then president of the European Union, said that in very clear terms. It has been a discussion between the Commission and European institutions in Germany, I think, ever since the very first plans were made. But we don't see it as a pipeline of European interest.
Okay. But it would bring cheap gas to Europe, so it would maybe help bring the prices down.
Well, the price doesn't really depend on how you transport it. That depends on your contract and whether your supplier is willing to sell it at a certain price. And there are other pipelines that are not at all used these days. One of the reasons why this crisis may last longer is indeed that the storage has not been filled. And that is really extraordinary and seems to be not a market-driven event, but a politically driven event.
When you talk to entrepreneurs these days, there's another threat to the European economy, that not only the energy prices, but also the shortage of labor in so many fields. Is that something the EU could help?
Well, our starting point is that we have no competence. Education and skills is competence for each member state. But it is of strategic importance for every one of us. So, of course, we try to help out wherever we can. So, for instance, in the recovery and resilience plans, part of the digital envelope is for digital skills. And we know that it's doable. For instance, in Greece, they have increased the number of citizens with basic skills enormously. And so we're pushing for this. But we're also pushing for expert skills. So, for instance, I have formed a commissioners group in order to have sort of a high-level dialogue with member states, so that our level of ability, our skills, what we know of, what we can do, becomes, a strategic sort of heads of state issue, because we get to be fewer and fewer on the European continent, and we need to be more and more clever and more capable in what we do in order to maintain the prosperity and the welfare in our societies.
And how important will immigration be in these plans?
Well, I think that legal immigration can play a very important role, because if people come here legally, it's a completely different thing than when they come here as the victims of human smugglers and crime and put their lives at stake. So the European Parliament has passed the basic legislation for a blue card. So the fundamental steps are taken for more people to come and to work in Europe.
But at the end, we have to accept that less and less people are coming, right? Because there's full employment in so many countries outside of the EU, and population is increasing elsewhere as well. So we have to try different paths, right?
Well, I think it's important that we also are quite capable ourselves, because talking about technology, if we don't have the people able of creating new technology, new innovations, to embody all the innovation environments that has been created in Europe over the last decade or so, well, then we will remain takers.
And also we need big steps in automation, right?
Also that, but also someone needs to create automation. You need to understand how you can reshape production processes, how you can build robots. Also that is eventually human-made. And we need to be able to do that. So to encourage, young people to be the creators also in these areas for people who have maybe one education to re-educate themselves, to use skills from several areas. That is of crucial importance. It's not a soft thing. It's a hard strategic matter to be better at what we do.
Thank you so much for being here this morning and for this interesting conversation.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Das also die EU-Perspektive von Wettbewerbskommissarin Margrethe Vestager. Und damit kommen wir zur französischen Perspektive von Bruno Le Maire, Emmanuel Macrons Wirtschaftsminister. Für ihn ist die Diskussion vor allem um Energieunabhängigkeit bei gleichzeitiger CO2-Neutralität eines der wichtigsten geopolitischen Themen der nächsten Jahrzehnte. Und statt Nord Stream 2 in den Mittelpunkt der aktuellen Diskussion um die Ukraine zu stellen, schlägt er vor, sich auf grünen Wasserstoff zu konzentrieren. Klare Worte von Bruno Le Maire dazu, außerdem zur europäischen Start-up-Szene und zur Rolle von Frankreich und Deutschland in Europa überhaupt, aber hören Sie selbst. Herzlich willkommen, guten Morgen, bonjour, good morning, welcome, Monsieur Le Maire.
Good morning, guten Morgen.
Great to have you here today. Let me only start the first question in German because not everybody knows that you can speak German pretty well. And the first question is a little bit about your private life. Sie waren im Schüleraustausch in Bremen in den 80er Jahren. Was haben Sie damals über Deutschland gelernt, was Ihnen heute hilft, Deutschland zu verstehen?
Ja, ich habe 2 oder 3 Monate in Bremen verbracht, als ich 15 oder 14 Jahre alt war. Und was ich über Deutschland gelernt habe, ist, dass Deutschland wirklich eine große Nation ist mit einer wirklich sehr reichen Kultur. Und ich glaube, dass was vielleicht in meinem Herz bleibt, ist die deutsche Kultur und die deutsche Sprache. Wir werden das Interview auf Englisch machen, aber wir könnten das Interview auch auf Deutsch machen.
Right, so that's the point when we switch into English. But back then in the 80s, the time you've been in Bremen was also the time of the big protests against atomic energy, right?
You're right, and I fully remember how strong the opposition to the Kernenergie was at that time in Bremen and everywhere in Europe. And when I'm talking with the new Wirtschaftsminister, I'm always aware of the fact that a very important part of the German population is against the nuclear energy. And that's the roots of this opposition to the nuclear energy are very deep in the German society. But on the other side, I think that the German people should also understand that the nuclear energy is at the core of the French nation. It has been decided by the General de Gaulle early 60s. Then we decided to build nuclear plants. And it is at the core of the political independence of the French nation. So that's one of the points on which we must be aware on the German side and on the French side that we don't have the same view, we don't have the same cultural roots, and we should respect the position of everybody.
But you can understand the German position, right?
I can understand the German position.
But you think it's wrong?
I think that from the point of view of the climate change, the position that we are defending with President Macron, which is to build on both renewable energies and nuclear plants, is the best one for the French interest, but also for the European interest. I can understand when I'm discussing with Robert Habeck And when Robert is explaining to me, well, we are totally against the nuclear energy, I know that. I've been living in Germany many times. I know the German people very well. I'm fully respectful of this position, but I'm just asking the German society to be also respectful of the French position. We want to build our energetic independence on the basis of both renewable energies and nuclear plants.
Energy is the big topic these days, not only the taxonomy we are just talked about, also the spiking gas prices. We've talked to Margrethe Vestager this morning. She was saying that Nord Stream 2 never was a project out of European interest. What do you think? Does Europe need Nord Stream 2 maybe to deliver more cheap gas from Russia? Or is it a project that's only something the Germans do and the rest of Europe has nothing to do with it?
You know, we are talking about maybe one of the most important geopolitical issue for the next decade. So we must be very much aware of what is at stake. What is at stake first is the reduction of CO2 emissions. That's absolutely vital for the future of Europe and for the future of the planet. So we must do our best efforts to accelerate the reduction of CO2 emissions. The second key point is independence. And that's why we took this decision to build new nuclear plants in France, because thanks to the nuclear plants, we are able to reduce the level of CO2 emissions, and we are not dependent on Russia or on any other foreign country. The third point is that, putting beside this question of Nord Stream, because that's a very sensitive one, it's a very important decision for the German government, we need to work together on new projects. I mean, for instance, on hydrogen. We have many things to do together, Germany and France, on hydrogen. So instead of putting in the middle of the discussion the most tricky issues, I would really advocate for putting forward the question of new energies and the building of new hydrogen capacities.
That's great. We are going to do this in a minute, but I just need to ask my question again. Nord Stream 2, yes or no? Are you against it?
That's not so simple like that. It's a decision that has been taken by the German government in close cooperation with Russia, with the view of having more gas coming from Russia thanks to Nord Stream 2. We know that it has been at the core of the discussions between Germany and Russia, and it is at the core of the current discussion on the Ukrainian crisis. And that's why I don't want to be too specific, because what is at stake is having a war or not having a war. Okay. So I think that instead of having two definitive answers to this question, we should broaden the scope and have a view at all the topics. Okay, let's do that. And for a minute, look into the European energy market. You've already said that we need more sources for energy, but also a question, do we need a different kind of market? It has been liberalized in the last couple of years. Do we, for example, need more longer lasting gas contracts with delivering countries, or other ideas to decrease the chance of spiking energy prices like we see today? I will be more specific on this question.
That's great.
Yes, we need a new European market as far as energy is concerned. I'm not satisfied by the way the European energy market is functioning. I think that we need long-term contract. Having too much spot prices is a difficulty when you have such an increase in the energy prices. Having long-term contract for both the private companies and the people is clearly in our own interest. Having the possibility of having a storage of gas, which is more important, 85, 90%, would be far more efficient instead of having a storage of gas which is not at the right level and which do not allow us to face a crisis like the one we have now. Having better grids between the European nations is also one of the things on which we should work all together. Mm-hmm. So I really think that there are many points on which we could improve the European energy market. Long-term contract, better storages of gas, and more important amount of gas being on a long-term contract. That's the proposal we are putting on the table. A very last point I would like to underline on this question of the European energy market is that that's very difficult for me to explain to the French people that they have to pay twice. They have to pay for the nuclear plants because we want energy without CO2 emissions. And we also have to pay for the gas plants in the eastern part of Europe. And we will have to pay the price of electricity at the price of the gas. This is one of the key points on which I think that we need a change, because we need a European market that allows us to invest in decarbonized energy, and that is an incentive for consumers to electrify their use.
Another project, and you mentioned the European cooperation in the field of energy. Another project many people are talking about is hydrogen, and there's a huge discussion about hydrogen cooperation between France and Germany. What does this whole dispute between these two countries mean for this planned cooperation if Germany will not accept hydrogen production with nuclear power as green hydrogen?
You know, if you want to produce hydrogen, you need electrolyzers, and we need to build electrolyzers plants. And if you want these electrolyzers plants to be efficient, you need a lot of electricity without CO2. So there are two models. The French model is to have all the value chain being based in France. The production of electricity without CO2 thanks to the renewable energies and thanks to the nuclear plants, the electrolyzers, the production of green hydrogen, and then the plants, for instance, steel plants that will be decarbonized thanks to the green hydrogen that will be produced in France. The German model is quite different because the idea could be to produce green hydrogen abroad, and then to make the transportation of this green hydrogen from abroad to Europe, which means that there are possibilities of cooperation between France and Germany on the technologies, on the electrolyzers, and that's already the case between Air Liquide and Siemens, for instance, and on the grids. So on all those topics, I'm totally open to a very strong cooperation with Germany. We have decided yesterday with Robert Habeck to put in place a working group with Germany with the view of identifying the field of cooperation on green hydrogen between our two countries. And I think that it is very promising.
But there's still this dispute in this field. And so how would you describe the French-German relations now at the beginning of this year, 2022, and at the beginning of the new term of the Ampel coalition?
First of all, on energy, I would prefer to use the word complementary approach instead of any kind of opposition. I put beside the question of nuclear because from a historic point of view, we know that there is a disagreement between our two countries. That's a fact. Yeah. But on all the other topics, on renewable energies, on offshore wind energy, on hydrogen, there is really a field for a huge and very promising cooperation between our two countries. And as far as the relationship between our two nations is concerned, we are at the core of Europe. Mm-hmm. We represent the future of Europe. We represent the possibility of building a sovereign Europe for the 21st century between China and the United States. I know Olaf Scholz very well. I've been working with him more than 2 years when he was finance minister. I know Christian Lindner very well. He will be in Paris today. The same for Robert Habeck. We are working very well together. You know, they are like, I would say they are like French colleagues. I'm working with my German colleagues the same way I'm working with my French colleagues. We are on the same boat. We are on the same European boat. And the idea is to face a competition with China and with the United States, not to face a competition between France and Germany. Mm-hmm. So you know that I'm a very strong advocate of this relationship between our two countries. And I'm very confident that this relationship will remain at the core of the European construction.
And how will it change, or how is it already changing compared to the last government?
I think that the role of the climate change is far more important now. We are fully aware that this question of climate change, energetic transition, CO2 emissions must be at the core of our relationship. We could talk about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, for instance, or about the climate club that has been proposed by Olaf Scholz and that we are supporting in the framework of the G7. So this question of climate change has become one of the first topics in the relationship between our two countries. Mm-hmm. The second point is, of course, the question of the Growth and Stability Pact, because we are at the end of the economic crisis. We now need to come back to sound public finances, and we need to find the right balance between investments and coming back to sound public finances. It will be, of course, at the core of our discussions.
I would like to come back to that in a minute, but for now, I would like to double down on what you've just said about the future of Europe's industry. So what does it look like, and how could an industry strategy look like for the center of Europe? What are the most important, maybe 3 points you have in mind?
First of all, we need a planification of our industrial investments. I believe, of course.
And why is that? Because Europe needs his own way between the tech superpowers, USA and China, right?
Which means that we need to be very clear on the investments that we stand ready to do for the very next future. Because for the investors, for the private companies, for the banks, that's very important to know what we intend to do over the next decades.
But sorry for interrupting, but planning for the economy doesn't always pay out very, very well, as we've seen in the past, right?
And that's why I deliberately used that word planification, because I really think that we need to find the right balance between private investment, market-driven, of course, and the need of having visibility for the investors. Because we are talking, you just asked me the question about the nuclear plants. We are talking about tens of billions of euros. So there is a need for visibility. What I mean by planification is visibility for the investors. We want to invest in the semiconductors, in hydrogen, in France, in the nuclear plants, in biotechnologies, in space, in reusable launches. On all those topics, we need to provide visibility to the investors. That's what I mean by planification. Planification means only visibility. The second point is that we need to protect our technologies. And the decisions that have been taken by the Commission and by all the member states, including France and Germany, to protect their new technologies, their know-how, and to avoid having investors coming from abroad taking the control of these technologies is a key decision that has been taken by the member states over the next years. And the very last point is the entry into force of a carbon border adjustment mechanism, because if we want to have a decarbonized economy, we also need to have the foreign investors or the foreign products paying the price of CO2 if they want to get access to the single market.
Later today, you will announce together with Christian Lindner a program to scale up European tech companies. How will that look like? And so I was reading about 2 billion to begin with and a growing fund later. What is the plan behind that?
The plan is to have the possibility for our startup to grow and to become big companies. You know, in France and in Germany and in many other member states, you have all the skills to be successful at the beginning of the story. So you have wonderful startups in all the fields, biotechnologies, semiconductors, hydrogen, digital technologies, 5G, 6G. On all those topics, we have wonderful startups. But the point is that they don't have access to the necessary funding to grow and to be giants. We want to have European technological giants. And the decision that we will announce together with Christian Lindner this afternoon will be a fund of funds providing new funding at a very high level, more than 1 billion euros, for those startups so that they can grow in Europe. We don't want to have any more startups being bought by the United States or by China, leaving Europe and not developing in Europe. We want our startups to grow in Europe.
So I understand that because from a broader perspective, there is enough money in the startup scene because investors coming from all over the world putting their money into European startups. But your point is more that you want to invest European money into European startups. Did I get that right?
That's it. We want European money to invest in European startups.
Why is that important? Why is that important? Why cannot Chinese or American investors put money into European startups?
For one single reason, we want to be independent. You know, when the US or China are putting money in our startups, that's not to be pleasant with European countries or with European peoples. Mm-hmm. It's just for the sake of taking the control of our technologies. And we don't want our technologies to be controlled by neither China nor the United States. We want to be an independent power.
Another big topic you also already mentioned is the reform of the European fiscal rules. In Germany, the liberals and conservatives are opposing that. And isn't that a dilemma for your plans?
No, there is no dilemma. I want to be very clear on the French strategy and what we intend to do under the French EU presidency. Mm-hmm. First of all, the key point is to have more growth, because the best way of reducing the public debt is to have more growth in Europe. We were just talking about startups growing. That's more growth, more jobs, and less public debt. So that's the key point. And when you are looking at the very last results of the French economy, we are doing very well with 7% of growth in 2021. And that's the same for the Eurozone. The Eurozone is doing very well. Then we need to find the right balance between coming back to sound public finances and investment. I want to be very clear. As a French finance minister, I want my country to reduce its public debt, to reduce its public deficit, and to come back to sound public finances. You don't have on the one side Germany asking for the reduction of public expenses and coming back as soon as possible to sound public finances, and on the other side France asking for more public expenses and refusing any kind of reduction of its public debt. That's not the case. We all want to come back to sound public finances.
Can you be a bit more concrete? Because this is pretty...
It means growth. It means reforms. We made a reform on unemployment. We also need a reform on the pension scheme in France. It also means to have some very clear decisions on the public expenses. And we stand ready with Emmanuel Macron to do that. You know that at the beginning of the mandate of Emmanuel Macron, we came back under the 3% of deficit. So we know that this is necessary for France to come back to sound public finances. And I really want to avoid any misunderstanding with my German friends on these key topics. We are a reliable partner. We are a strong partner. And we are a responsible partner which wants to come back to sound public finances. But on the other hand, we should not do the mistake we made in 2010 and 2011 when we decided to come back to sound public finances with a path which was too ambitious, and we killed growth. That's the single point that we want to avoid, taking into account that we need growth and we need investment for the climate change.
But to come back to sound public finances, as you said, does that mean get back to Maastricht in some time?
It means that we have to define, and that's one of the proposal which is on the table, which is still discussing. And there is, I want to be very clear, for the time being, there is no agreement about the proposals put on the table by Commissioner Paolo Gentiloni. But one of the proposals that I find very interesting is to say, well, look at the situation as it stands. You have a level of public debt in Italy more than 160%.
Yes.
In Germany, it is less than 70%. So the difference is 100 points. We have to take as a starting point that you have a gap of 100 points in the level of public debt. So maybe it could be a solution to have different schedules, different timetables for each member of the Eurozone. That's one of the proposals put on the table by Commissioner Gentiloni. For the time being, there is no agreement, but I find it one interesting way for the definition of the new rules of the Growth and Stability Pact.
Because I find interesting looking at all the plans you just mentioned, the big plan to reshape France industry, France 2030, which will cost billions of investment. So this will drive debt, and the debts will go up all over Europe. And it's happening in a time when interests are going up. So isn't that a pretty dangerous situation?
We just need to find the right balance. And I would say two remarks. I would like to add two remarks to what you just said. First, we are not the only country which is investing. Germany put 60 billion euros on the table. The Netherlands put 75 billions on the table. We just put 30 billion euros on the table. So we are not investing the same amount, but everybody is aware of the necessity of putting money on the table to invest in renewable energies, in semiconductors, in electric car batteries. On all those topics, we are all in the same situation. And my second remark is to insist on the fact that by investing, you are creating growth, and by creating growth, you are reducing the public debt. It won't be enough, but that's one of the response to the level of the public debt now in Europe.
But is the European Central Bank is on the right track at the moment? I mean, inflation is very high in France as well. Is it on the right course, or do you need a different kind of action?
No, I'm responsible for the fiscal policy in France. And Christine Lagarde is responsible for the monetary policy of the ECB. My line has always been not to comment the decisions of the ECB, because the ECB is totally independent. That's in the European Treaty, and I want to abide by the European Treaty.
But still, inflation is a huge topic in France. Can you give us some ideas? What are you going to do to solve that problem? It will become a big issue in the elections now.
You're right. It has already become one of the key issues. You know that more than half of the inflation is driven by the energy prices. So that's why we gave a response to the rise of the energy prices by capping the price of gas, by capping the price of electricity. I think that we gave a very strong response to the increase of energy prices in France, and we remain very much vigilant on the way things are developing, because we are fully aware of the impact of this situation on the French households.
Okay, so 50% is energy price, and the rest you can't do anything about it.
More than 60% of the increase of prices is driven by energy. And then the rest is driven by the fact that there is a very strong economic recovery. But the points on which we are acting as much as possible is energy, because I really think that it will be at the core of the French concern and the European concern over the next month and next years.
Speaking of the elections coming up in April, analysts say that it's pretty likely that Emmanuel Macron will be re-elected. You have been part of his cabinet now for the past 5 years. Will you still be in office at the end of this year?
We will see, but I hope that Emmanuel Macron will be re-elected, because we are on the right track. France is on the right track. France is back. 7% of growth. 1 million jobs created over the last 5 years. So we are on the right track. We should stick to that economic policy, which is giving concrete results to the French people, with one key objective, which is to have full employment for the French society over the next 5 years.
But you personally will carry on as well?
I hope so.
Okay.
But it's not me who decides.
So you're right, the economic numbers are pretty well, but this would be my last question. We also, when we look into France, we see this intense polarization. Is that something you just have to accept now, or do you see a way out of this?
Well, I think that we should avoid any kind of polarization.
But how is
it the case in the US? You're right. That's a key question. We don't want to have a political situation in France like in the US, where there is so much polarization that no compromise is possible. I think that a good policy must be driven by the possibility of finding agreements and compromises. That's exactly what you did in Germany. You found a possibility of compromise between different people, and this can deliver a very clear path for the future of Germany. With Emmanuel Macron, we have decided to overcome this very old opposition between the left wing and the right wing, with the view of gathering all the people that share the same view about the market, about the urban construction, about the relationship between France and Germany, about the necessity of creating jobs for everybody, about the necessity of improving the French competitiveness. And I really hope that this policy will allow us to avoid this bad polarization.
Bruno Le Maire, thank you so much for joining us today.
Danke vielmals.
Und damit sind wir auch schon wieder am Ende von Handelsblatt Disrupt. Wie immer freue ich mich über Kommentare in der Handelsblatt Disrupt LinkedIn-Gruppe oder senden Sie mir gerne eine Mail. Die Details finden Sie in den Shownotes. Danke an dieser Stelle auch für die Unterstützung von Alexander Voss und Regina Körner und Migo Fecke von professionalpodcast.com, dem Dienstleister für Strategieberatung und Podcastproduktionen. Wenn Sie möchten und grundsätzlich Interesse daran haben, immer auf dem Laufenden zu sein, jederzeit alle Artikel des Handelsblatts zu lesen, Zugriff also auf alle unsere Recherchen zu haben und natürlich auch alle Podcasts zu hören, dann habe ich heute ein Handelsblatt Disrupt Vorteilsangebot für Sie reserviert. Schauen Sie doch einfach mal nach auf handelsblatt.com/Mehrwirtschaft. Die Details finden Sie in den Shownotes. Wir hören uns dann nächste Woche Freitag wieder. Bis dahin wünsche ich Ihnen interessante digitale, aber natürlich auch analoge Zeiten. Ihr Sebastian Matthes.